March 1945, the Rhineland. A Waffen-SS Obersturmführer named nothing you'd recognize, one of thousands, stands in a muddy holding pen behind American lines, with his hands still raised from the surrender 20 minutes earlier. Snow is turning to slush under a few hundred boots. Somewhere behind him, an artillery duel is still going, dull and distant now, no longer his problem. He has spent 5 years being told he belongs to the finest soldiers on the planet. He has believed it, the way a man believes something that has been repeated to him since he was 17 years old, in a training barracks at Bad Tolds, or Dachau, or wherever his particular division first hardened him into what he became. The Waffen-SS did not accept weak men. It did not accept men who complained about cold or hunger or fear. Its entire identity, drilled into every recruit from the earliest selection boards, was that suffering built the superior soldier, and softness built the inferior one. A man who could not endure did not deserve the uniform. And then an American mess sergeant, bored, indifferent, working through a line of prisoners the way he'd work through any other task on a Tuesday, hands him a tin plate with hot stew on it, right there at the collection point. Not as a reward, not as a special occasion arranged for propaganda cameras. Just standard procedure for prisoners waiting to be processed and marched to the rear. And the SS officer stares at it the way a man stares at something that quietly, without any drama at all, contradicts everything he has been taught to believe about the world and about the enemy he has spent years fighting. This is a story about that stare, about what an ideologically hardened elite soldier saw when he looked down at an enemy army's dinner, handed to him not out of generosity but out of routine, and why what he saw frightened men like him far more than any tank or artillery barrage ever had. It's a story about two armies built on two completely different theories of what a soldier was worth, and about how one of those theories, worked out in dull peacetime planning offices by men nobody remembers, quietly and unglamorously won the war before the fighting in the West had even reached its final months. To understand why the shock landed as hard as it did, you first have to understand what the Waffen-SS believed about itself. Because that belief is exactly what made the collision so violent when the two systems finally sat down, figuratively speaking, across the same mess line. Before we go on, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far this story travels. And if you're loving it so far, join the family by hitting subscribe, because tomorrow we've got something special lined up just for you. The Waffen-SS did not think of itself as an ordinary army, and in its early years it was not treated as one. It began in the 1930s as a small armed formation attached to the Nazi Party's paramilitary apparatus, built around the idea of an ideological and racial vanguard, a fighting order selected for physical toughness, political conviction, and a willingness to endure conditions that would break a regular conscript. Recruits went through selection standards that in the earliest years rejected men for something as minor as a filling in a tooth or a few centimeters short of a minimum height requirement. Training at the SS academies emphasized brutal physical conditioning, constant ideological instruction, and a deliberate cult of hardness, in which deprivation was treated as a feature of the training, rather than a hardship to be minimized. An SS man who complained about hunger or cold was, by the internal values of his own organization, confessing precisely the kind of weakness that should have disqualified him from wearing the uniform in the first place. This self-image mattered enormously for how Waffen-SS units interpreted their own supply problems as the war dragged on and conditions worsened. In the early campaigns, Poland, the invasion of France, the initial drive into the Soviet Union, German logistics were stretched thin, but not broken, and Waffen-SS formations were frequently prioritized over ordinary Wehrmacht divisions, for whatever equipment and rations existed, a privilege that reinforced the sense of being an elite, apart from the common soldier. By the time the organization had expanded from a few thousand men in the 1930s into dozens of divisions by 1944, absorbing conscripts, foreign volunteers, and increasingly younger and less selectively trained recruits, just to fill the ranks, the old standards of selection had loosened considerably, but the internal mythology of toughness had not. If anything, the mythology hardened further, even as the actual quality and conditioning of the men wearing the uniform declined. By the winter of 1944, on the Western Front, the entire German war economy was collapsing under the accumulated weight of years of attrition. the systematic Allied bombing of rail networks and synthetic fuel production, and the loss of the occupied territories that had been feeding both the German civilian population and its army for the better part of 4 years. The numbers tell the story better than any single anecdote could. German civilian bread rations, already reduced multiple times earlier in the war, fell sharply again through 1944, and army rations tracked the same downward curve, often arriving at the front even thinner than what civilians back home were receiving, because military distribution networks were breaking down faster than the rationing bureaucracy could adjust its own paperwork. German frontline infantry by the winter of 1944 into 1945 were regularly estimated by post-war assessments to be receiving well under 2,000 calories a day, a level any physiologist would recognize as inadequate for the sustained physical demands of marching, digging in frozen ground, and fighting. Ersatz coffee brewed from roasted grain and chicory had already replaced the real thing years earlier for most units. Bread was increasingly cut with fillers to stretch a flour supply that could no longer be replenished from occupied France or Ukraine, both of which had functioned as the Reich's breadbaskets for years, and both of which were now gone or in the process of being lost. The Waffen-SS, elite reputation or not, ate from the exact same broken pipeline as every ordinary Wehrmacht conscript. There was no separate SS supply chain immune to the collapse of German rail transport or the exhaustion of occupied farmland. By the Ardennes offensive in December 1944, the last major German attack of the war in the West, SS panzer divisions were launching an operation whose entire success depended in part on capturing American fuel depots along the route of advance, because there was simply not enough German fuel stockpiled to sustain the push much past its opening days. An army that plans a major offensive around stealing its own war material from the enemy mid-attack is an army that has already, on some quiet arithmetic level, admitted the numbers no longer work in its favor. The men doing the fighting were not told this directly. They were simply told to advance, to endure, to trust that the toughness bred into them since their training days would carry them through whatever shortages developed. It was the same answer the organization had always given. It was about to stop being sufficient. Now, put an American GI's dinner tray next to that picture, because the contrast is where this story actually lives. In 1941, a University of Minnesota physiologist named Ansel Keys was handed a government contract to design a compact ration for soldiers who needed real calories but couldn't realistically carry a full mess kit and a hot meal into a foxhole, a glider, or a parachute jump. Keys tested early versions on small groups of soldiers at Fort Snelling, refining the mix of hard biscuits, dense meat products, and concentrated sweets over the following years into what became Field Ration K, named after Keys himself. By 1944, the United States Army was procuring it by the tens of millions of units annually, on top of the heavier canned C ration, and, whenever the tactical situation allowed a unit to be resupplied from the rear, full hot meals cooked from mobile field kitchens. A standard K-ration breakfast unit carried a small can of meat and eggs, hard biscuits, a packet of instant coffee, sugar, a fruit or cereal bar, a small pack of cigarettes, chewing gum, and water purification tablets. The dinner and supper units carried more canned meat or processed cheese, more biscuits, hard candy, or a genuine commercial chocolate bar in temperate conditions, more cigarettes, and a powdered beverage mix. Add a full day's issue together, and a frontline American infantryman was provisioned for somewhere in the range of 3,000 to 3,500 calories, roughly double, and in the worst stretches of the German collapse, considerably more than double, what his opposite number across the line was actually receiving by the last winter of the war. But the raw calorie count, striking as it is not actually the detail that unsettled captured German soldiers most, Waffen-SS or otherwise, when they finally got a close look at what an American private carried into combat. It was the small design decisions layered underneath the calories, the parts nobody back home would have thought to brag about. The waxed cardboard outer carton was waterproof, and a soldier could burn the empty box to help boil water for coffee, a use the designers had anticipated rather than stumbled into. The small tin of meat had a metal twist key soldered directly onto the lid, so a man in a foxhole in the rain didn't need a separate knife or bayonet just to get at his food. at a time when German ration cans still frequently required exactly that kind of improvised tool. The cigarettes came packed in a small reinforced sleeve, specifically so they wouldn't crush or bend in transit, from a factory in the American Midwest to a hedgerow in Normandy or a ridge in the Ardennes. And there was gum in a combat ration, an item with essentially zero nutritional value whatsoever, included for exactly one reason, because the people who planned the ration understood, in a way the Waffen-SS's entire training philosophy explicitly rejected, that a soldier's morale and psychological comfort were themselves a logistics problem worth solving, with the same seriousness as ammunition supply. This is the detail that surfaces again and again in the tone of post-war Allied interrogations of captured German personnel, Waffen-SS prisoners among them, taken during the Ardennes fighting and the long retreat across the Rhine that followed. It generally was not the meat that got to them first. It was the gum, and the reinforced cigarette sleeve, and the twist key on the can. It was the sudden, uncomfortable realization that an industrial power several thousand miles away had decided that the psychological comfort of an individual private, a man who by German military philosophy should have needed nothing more than discipline, ideology, and a rifle, was worth manufacturing on a scale of billions of units during the exact same years it was also building the tanks, the aircraft carriers, the long-range bombers, and, though none of them knew it yet, an atomic weapon. That is the actual collision underneath this story. Not tank armor versus tank armor. Philosophy versus philosophy. The Waffen-SS had been built from its founding on the idea that hardship purified the soldier, and comfort corroded him. The American Quartermaster Corps had built its entire wartime supply doctrine on close to the opposite premise, worked out in dry, unglamorous planning documents throughout the 1930s by officers whose names never made it into any popular history, that a fed, warm, reasonably comfortable soldier was a more effective and, crucially, a more sustainable fighting instrument than a hardened, hungry one. Two competing theories of what an army actually is. Only one of them survived 4 more years of industrial-scale war without breaking. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Picture the specific moment more carefully, because some version of it happened over and over throughout late 1944 and into the spring of 1945, and the shape of it shows up consistently in the tone of post-war interrogation summaries, and in the accounts German veterans gave in later decades once they were willing to talk about it at all. A Waffen-SS prisoner, often young, sometimes barely out of his teens, by the desperate final conscription waves of 1944, sometimes a hardened veteran who had already survived the Eastern Front's even harsher conditions, is walked to the rear through an American position under guard. He passes a field kitchen. Steam is rising off something that is unmistakably hot food, not the thin, watery potato soup his own units had taken to calling by the name of an empty Nazi Party anthem, because the soup, like the song, was hollow and meant nothing once you actually examined what was inside it. He sees ordinary American soldiers eating fresh bread that had been baked that same morning at a Corps-level bakery and trucked forward, along with everything else moving up the supply route. Depending on the exact timing and location, he may see something that his mind initially refuses to process as real at all. Containers of actual ice cream being distributed near a position close enough to the line to still be within artillery range. The product of small mobile ice cream units. The Quartermaster Corps had begun operating by early 1945, specifically to get a frozen treat forward to combat troops. An idea so far outside anything in his own army's supply doctrine that it does not register, at first, as anything other than a hallucination, brought on by hunger and exhaustion. Post-war debriefs of German prisoners repeatedly describe a fairly consistent arc to this kind of reaction. First comes disbelief, an assumption that whatever he's looking at must represent a special occasion, an officer's private mess, or some kind of display staged deliberately for the benefit of watching prisoners. Then, once he is told, no, this is simply what these men eat as a matter of routine, comes a kind of stunned recalculation, the visible effort of a man trying to fit a new fact into an old picture of the world that the fact does not fit into cleanly. And then, for the more ideologically committed prisoners, the Waffen-SS men who had spent years absorbing the doctrine that the American soldier was a soft, racially inferior product of a decadent capitalist culture, Unsuited to real war, something closer to a genuine cognitive injury sets in. Their entire framework for understanding the enemy simply does not survive contact with the enemy's dinner. Some of them, at least initially, tried to force the old framework to hold anyway. And this part of the pattern is worth sitting with, because it is where the human stubbornness of ideology shows through most clearly. There is a well-documented tendency, described by multiple German officers in post-war accounts, of veterans looking at American abundance, the cigarettes, the gum, the individually wrapped everything, and reading it as confirmation of weakness rather than strength. These men cannot fight without their little comforts, the reasoning went. Real soldiers, Prussian soldiers, SS soldiers, are tempered by want and hardened by scarcity, not softened by chocolate bars. And then those same skeptical observers watched American infantry divisions absorb the kind of brutal, sustained losses inflicted in the Hurtgen forest and around Bastogne, and keep functioning, keep attacking, without the collapse in cohesion that was supposed to separate hardened warriors from comfortable children playing soldier. The theory that comfort produced softness did not survive that evidence either. What the evidence actually showed, and what senior German officers eventually admitted under interrogation once the war had ended, was closer to the reverse of what they had been taught for years. Comfort, delivered reliably and at industrial scale, produced endurance. And endurance, not toughness pursued for its own sake as a matter of ideological pride, turned out to be the thing that actually decided a war of attrition against an opponent whose factories were still running at full capacity. There is a further wrinkle worth pausing on here, because it complicates the picture in a way the simplest version of this story tends to flatten out. Not every Waffen-SS unit arrived at this realization at the same speed, or from the same starting point. Divisions that had spent years fighting on the Eastern Front, men who had already endured winters far more brutal than anything Western Europe produced, sometimes reacted to American abundance with something closer to weary resignation than shock. A sense that this was simply one more confirmation of a gap they had already begun to suspect existed. Younger formations, raised late in the war from conscripts who had never known anything but wartime scarcity and who had absorbed the regime's propaganda about American softness without ever having a pre-war memory to compare it against, tended to react with the sharpest and most visible disorientation, precisely because they had nothing else to measure the discovery against. The shock, in other words, was not uniform. It landed hardest on the men who had believed the propaganda most completely. None of this happens without a supply chain capable of moving an enormous, unglamorous tonnage of food, fuel, and equipment from factories scattered across the American Midwest and East Coast, all the way to a foxhole in the Ardennes forest. And that supply chain has its own story. One the SS officer standing at that collection point almost certainly had no direct visibility into, even though its existence was, in effect, exactly what he was tasting on his tin plate. When Patton's Third Army broke out across France in the late summer of 1944, faster than Allied planners had anticipated, American logistics officers built, in a planning session that ran roughly 36 hours straight, a one-way trucking circuit that came to be known as the Red Ball Express. Close to 6,000 trucks, running two dedicated parallel routes closed to all other traffic, moving supplies 24 hours a day for weeks on end, delivered an average of over 12,000 tons of material daily at its peak, and more than 400,000 tons total of food, fuel, and ammunition over roughly 11 weeks of continuous operation. A significant share of its drivers were African-American soldiers serving in the still segregated army of that era, driving through the night without headlights to avoid drawing the attention of German aircraft. Men who in many cases could not have sat at the same lunch counter as a white officer back home in the towns they came from, keeping an entire army's dinner and ammunition supply moving forward through a shattered French rail network and a running fuel crisis of their own making do. Compare that operational picture to the German logistics situation in the exact same period. The Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS together still relied on well over 2 million horses for the movement of supplies throughout the war, not as an emergency stopgap, but as genuine core infrastructure. At the very moment American trucks were moving over 12,000 tons a day through France, along dedicated one-way highways built and maintained specifically for that purpose. German fuel production, hammered relentlessly by the strategic bombing campaign against synthetic fuel plants through 1944, had fallen so far by the winter that the Ardennes offensive itself was explicitly planned around the capture of American gasoline depots, along the intended route of advance, because there was not enough German fuel in reserve to reach the operation's objectives without it. A Waffen-SS Panzer spearhead, advancing on borrowed time, and depending on captured enemy fuel to keep its own engines running, is not a hardened elite outpacing a soft and decadent opponent. It is an army quietly eating its own war plan alive, from the inside, one gasoline can at a time, while still telling its own soldiers that endurance and ideological will would somehow be enough to close the gap. This is the part senior German officers came to understand with real clarity only once the war in the West was over, and there was nothing left to lose by admitting it. Gerd von Rundstedt, the senior German commander in the West for much of this period, when asked afterward to explain the ultimate failure of the campaign in France and the Low Countries, did not point first to inferior tank quality or Allied air superiority, both of which were real problems, but neither of which he named as the decisive one. He pointed to the supply system. He meant it as a blunt critique of his own side's failures. But folded into that admission was essentially the same recognition every individual Waffen-SS prisoner had stumbled onto independently at some mess line behind American positions somewhere in Belgium or Western Germany. The war had never been decided purely by who fought harder, or with more conviction in any single engagement, however much SS training doctrine insisted otherwise. It had been decided, in large part, by which side could keep feeding, fueling, clothing, and re-equipping its ordinary soldiers for one more month than the other side could manage to do the same. It is worth sitting for a moment on just how much tonnage that actually meant in practice, because the number itself is where the real weight of this story sits. A single American infantry division in the field required something in the neighborhood of 700 to 800 tons of supply a day to function properly, and only a fraction of that figure was ammunition. The rest was fuel, spare parts, mail, medical supplies, replacement clothing, and food, a category that by design and by policy was never treated as an afterthought, squeezed in around the edges of the more serious business of war. Multiply that figure across the roughly 24 Allied divisions advancing across France in the late summer of 1944, and you arrive at a daily transport requirement in the tens of thousands of tons, delivered day after day without interruption, by a logistics system built years in advance for exactly this purpose. The German army, fighting the same campaign on the same ground in the same season, had nothing remotely comparable to move against that number. And every soldier standing in a German ration line that winter was, in effect, standing downstream of that gap. There is one more layer to this story that the frontline collision alone doesn't fully capture, and it involves what happened to captured German soldiers, Waffen-SS included, once they were actually moved into longer-term custody, rather than just processed at a temporary collection point. Large numbers of German prisoners, including men from Waffen-SS formations, captured during the fighting in France and later in the retreat toward Germany, were eventually shipped across the Atlantic and held in prisoner of war camps inside the continental United States, put to work on American farms and in American factories under the terms of the Geneva Convention. Multiple post-war accounts, including memoirs and oral histories collected decades later, describe these men being fed rations essentially identical to what American soldiers themselves received, and reacting with the same disoriented mixture of gratitude and disbelief that captured men at the front had shown. Prisoners who arrived, malnourished after months or years of declining German army rations, documented measurable weight gain over their time in American custody. In some cases, significant enough that camp medical staff noted it explicitly in their records. This was not a special program designed to impress or convert captured enemy soldiers, but it was, again, simply the standard the American military logistics system had already built for its own men, extended by policy and convention to prisoners as well, because building two separate supply systems, one generous and one deliberately punitive, would have been its own kind of logistical complication nobody in the Quartermaster Corps had any particular appetite for. For an ideologically committed Waffen-SS prisoner, this extended encounter with American abundance was, if anything, more corrosive to the old worldview than the single dramatic moment at a forward collection point had been. A brief shock at the front could be rationalized away as an isolated anomaly, a lucky supply run, a display staged for effect. Months of consistent, unremarkable, reliably delivered abundance in a prisoner of war camp in the middle of the United States, could not be explained away nearly as easily. It was simply what the system produced, day after day, without any apparent strain, in a country that was simultaneously fighting a two-ocean war, on a scale no other nation on Earth was attempting at the same time, while also feeding its own civilian population, its allies overseas, through Lend-Lease shipments, and, without any evident tension between the two goals, the men it had captured from the opposing side. Some of these prisoners, once repatriated after the war, and living ordinary lives back in a defeated and rationed Germany, later described the period of their captivity in terms that had less to do with resentment than with a kind of reluctant, backhanded admiration for the sheer scale of what they had witnessed. It was not the kind of admiration their wartime training had prepared them to feel toward an enemy. It was closer to the admiration one professional gives another for solving a problem more completely than they themselves ever managed to. Step back to that Rhineland collection point one final time. The SS officer with the plate of stew in his hands did not choose to encounter it, and that fact matters more than it might first appear. He didn't request it. It wasn't staged. It was simply standard procedure, the same basic treatment extended to any prisoner regardless of rank, unit, or the color of the patches on his collar. Because the American system that produced it wasn't built around impressing captured enemy officers in the first place. It was built around a peacetime calculation made a decade earlier by quartermaster corps planners nobody made movies about. Men who had studied the First World War's brutal lesson that roughly half of America's own military deaths in that earlier conflict had come not from enemy action, but from disease and exposure, and who concluded from that lesson that feeding, clothing, and properly maintaining a soldier's body was never an act of charity. It was a tactical multiplier, calculated in the same cold, unsentimental terms an army uses to calculate ammunition tonnage or fuel consumption. A well-fed division that can actually put its full paper strength into the line on a given morning outnumbers. In practice, a division whose men are quietly deteriorating from malnutrition and frostbite long before a single shot is exchanged. The Waffen-SS had staked its entire identity on the opposite bet, that ideological conviction and a cultivated tolerance for suffering could substitute for logistics indefinitely. For a while, in 1939 and 1940, and even into the opening phases of the Eastern Front campaign, that bet looked almost defensible, because German logistics, while never generous by American standards, had not yet fully collapsed. By the winter of 1944 into 1945, the bet had failed completely, and the evidence of that failure was sitting, quite literally, on a tin plate in front of men who had spent years genuinely believing themselves incapable of losing to soldiers who ate this well. If this kind of deep dive into the side of the war, the recruiting posters and the newsreels never bothered to show you the calories, the twist key cans, the reinforced cigarette sleeves, the trucks running all night without headlights, means something to you, hit the like button. It costs nothing, and it helps keep this kind of forgotten history in front of people who actually want the full picture, instead of the highlight reel of tank battles and famous generals. None of this made the individual American soldier a better or braver man than the individual German or Waffen-SS soldier standing across the line from him in the snow, and it would be a mistake to read it that way. Plenty of American units went hungry too, whenever the front outran its own trucks. And plenty of American soldiers fought and died just as badly supplied on any given bad week as their German counterparts. But it made the American system, considered as a whole, a fundamentally better system, one built years in advance on a quiet, unglamorous premise that the individual soldier's body and mind were worth deliberately investing in, rather than simply spending down as a resource to be consumed. The Waffen-SS had been taught for the better part of a decade that suffering was proof of superiority, that a hardened man needed nothing but conviction to prevail. What that officer at the collection point actually learned, staring down at a plate of hot stew he had been assured for years his enemy was too soft and decadent to even deserve, was that he had spent the entire war measuring the wrong thing. The men who built the system that produced that plate of stew never got statues. There is no monument anywhere to the quartermaster corps planners who spent the 1930s writing dull reports about calorie requirements and ration weights. No memorial to the anonymous mess sergeants who handed hot food to prisoners as a matter of routine rather than policy. No plaque for the drivers who kept the Red Ball Express moving through French nights without headlights so that stew could arrive hot at a collection point in the Rhineland in March of 1945. But every one of them was, in his own unglamorous way, fighting the same war as the men carrying rifles. And in the long run, their war may have mattered just as much. If you've been watching this channel for a while and still haven't subscribed, now is the moment. Hit the button, turn on the notification bell, and join the community. We are here every day with the military history stories that deserve to be told straight, without softening what was hard, and without forgetting what was, in its own way, exactly right. Thank you for watching. Respect the fallen, honor the veterans, and never forget what they were fighting against. We will see you in the next video.